So earlier this morning, we looked at that first task for prophetic communities of telling the truth. And the second task that Walter Brueggemann speaks about is this task of grieving. To grieve in a society that practices denial. And I think this is one of the, if telling the truth is uncomfortable, grief is 1,000 times more uncomfortable, I think. But they're deeply connected. And so there's what I appreciate about this image and the juxtaposition of C.S. Lewis's comment that I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. What I want to acknowledge here is that this is about a range of emotion. And haven't we all been taught not to have emotions in so many ways? Women more so, but men as well. So we've all kind of been conditioned to have a very circumscribed, limited expression of emotion. And so women can be tired. We might be able to be sad, but we can never be angry. Our brothers can be angry, but they could probably never be sad. And so this is how we're socialized. And then we have an overlay of piety around what feelings have a morality connected to them. And so this is so much, I think, of what has happened that we have been able to grow into a much more mature expression of adulthood and a much more mature emotional life. And so what I hope for is that we have matured for a spaciousness where we can really hold grief and welcome it. And what I want to suggest here too is that if we think about the terms grief, mourning, and lament, and they're each different, but they overlap. And there's a personal dimension to each of those, a personal dimension to grief and mourning and lament. There's also a communal and collective dimension to grief and mourning and lament. Just as the way when we tell the truth, our personal truth, it's a building block for greater and greater truth in civil society, when we're able to tend to our grief and our losses and mourn that is a building block to the healing of society. So Francis Weller is an American psychologist and spiritual writer. And he notes that our personal experiences of loss and suffering are now bound inextricably with dying coral reefs, melting polar caps, the silencing of languages, the collapse of democracy, and the fading of civilization. And the personal and the planetary are inseparable, as is our healing. Because we are social beings, we are made for one another, we are made for community. And so what impacts me impacts you. What impacts all of us together impacts the world around us. There's just no way of separating that out. And so the work that we do personally and communally around tending our losses and tending our grief and mourning and lament, anything that we do to tend our personal healing is the contribution we make to help heal the world. So when we think that that our tending to our spiritual lives, or our tending to our prayer lives, or tending to our emotional lives, when we are tempted to think that that is self-serving, or that it's narcissistic, or that we are just navel-gazing, we have to challenge ourselves to remember that how we are in the world impacts the world, and how we heal helps to heal the world. So I just want to be so clear about that tending our emotional experience is not navel-gazing. It actually is, I believe, a part of the prophetic witness that we bring. And so, so there's so many messages that we get to not speak of our sorrow and our grief. And I offer this piece of a poem by Denise Levertov. To speak of sorrow works on it. It moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. To give language to our losses, to speak of it, to author it into the world in language, creates a spaciousness for the grace that comes from that. And I think that, as we know that grief is complicated and grief is multifaceted, and there's all sorts of grief. But I want to acknowledge the one, there's a type of grief that I don't think this may or may not be new to your awareness, but there's a type of grief called disenfranchised grief. And what disenfranchised grief is a description that's offered to describe, to label or identify the kinds of grief and losses that we experience that are not necessarily widely acknowledged. So the death of a loved one is a widely acknowledged type of grief. The loss of a mother, a father, a sibling, a child. Those are what we ordinarily imagine that this is grief. The kinds of grief that I believe that you and I and other religious experience and have experienced are the losses and the griefs around the loss of our ministries, the sale of our mother houses, the transfer of ownership and sponsorship to others than ourselves. Those, I think, are disenfranchised grief. There are things that, they're not widely understood. When I was in office, I served in leadership for 10 years in my community. And, when they go look back in history, they'll probably call me the closer. Because in my first year, we closed our academy. We could not sustain our academy, which was our first and founding ministry. From 1869 till 2019, or 2009, which was it was the market crash, so many factors, we couldn't sustain it. That was my first year. In my last year, we sold our nursing home, 120 beds, where our sisters were cared for, as well as others in the surrounding community. Both of these physically attached to our residential portion, because at some point somebody thought that was a really good idea to just attach all your buildings. So when we sold our villa, it was very public. The news of it was public, everything was public about it. And my brother said to me, "Wow, Mary, that was probably a really good deal, really good business deal." I could not even breathe. because I couldn't describe to him what that transfer of ownership meant. There was no way I could describe that loss. Like, there was no way I could describe the loss that even as a community we can still not absorb, the loss of our academy, which was the first and founding ministry. It's the reason we came into being. And so those are, we all have that. That is what I would name. Those kinds of things are the loss, the grief that we feel about that is we can call that disenfranchised because it's not widely understood. And when it's not widely understood, we tend to not tend it. Because where would we talk about it? How would we manage that? How would we tend it? But it's real. And so as we walk through this reflection on grief and mourning and lament, I just want to encourage you to really acknowledge, as you're able, that all of the losses that maybe you thought were imagined, but they are real. And to listen to enter into this through the lens of those losses, both personal and communal.
Yep.
So this image is called Anger Transference. And it's by Richard Sargent from 1954. And you see in this where, the man goes to work, gets, kind of reamed out by his boss, goes home, reams out his wife, she reams out her son, and he reams out the cat. This is the pattern. And Parker Palmer is an American Quaker spiritual writer that I imagine that many of you know and have read some of his writing. He still suffers a lifetime of intermittent deep depression. And so he writes through that lens of his suffering. And he makes this observation that violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. Violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. And so again, we're these stratas, we're experiencing it. Think about our personal lives, our communal lives, the ecclesial life, and the societal life. The violence that we're seeing manifested on a global scale begs the question of what is the suffering that has not been tended? What is the suffering that has not been tended? And we can see this in our own lives. I think about this a lot when, living in community, that could get a little dicey. And so I have to ask myself when I'm feeling particularly edgy and I'm feeling particularly irritated and annoyed, like, what am I not tending myself? When I see myself engaging in microaggressions, we all do it. Passive-aggressive behavior, these little microaggressions. What is it? What is it that I need to tend to? Because left unchecked, we see what happens when they escalate and left unchecked, when it becomes a lifetime of microaggressions that become macroaggressions, that become institutional aggressions, that become societal aggressions. So what is the work? What are the ways that we have? And I think this is another space where we can think about prophetic witness, of what can we offer? What can we offer the world around us, those who know us? How do we model tending to our suffering, tending to loss, tending to grief? And that, the quote from C.S. Lewis, I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. When we encounter those really harsh emotions in ourselves and in others, what are the ways that we can befriend them, sit with them long enough until they reveal their true name? And to believe that this is a contribution to the healing of the world. So I want to talk a little bit about this, about nostalgia, and because I think that this is a way of, I think that some of what we're seeing in the world today, and again, I'm just going to speak from the American context. You can connect it to your own context. But what we're seeing, I believe what we're seeing in the world today is a distortion and a desire to return to something that was mythical. So a number of years ago, probably in 2008 maybe, there was a sociologist, Svetlana Boym, who published an article really unpacking these two types of nostalgia. There was restorative nostalgia and reflective nostalgia. And she talked about nostalgia being this kind of, the origin of the word is from the Greek of nostos and algis. So this longing to return home. And what I learned in her writing was that nostalgia first, like this, what was called nostalgia, what we've come to understand as nostalgia, first manifested itself in the 1800s, and it was perceived to be a pathology, a sickness. And it manifested itself in, I believe it was either I think it was with the German army, or there was where the men were sent overseas. They were sent to another country, and they developed this longing for home. They became incapacitated. And it's what we now would understand or call homesickness. But it literally was a pathology. It was a diagnosis. And what she writes about is that modern nostalgia is a mourning, this the grief. It's a mourning for the impossibility of mythical return. The impossibility of mythical return for the loss of an enchanted world with clear boundaries and values. So think back to earlier this morning, Walter Brueggemann's observation that the world is coming at us and nothing looks like we would imagine. Any category or boundary or assumption or value that we might have held in the past, they're unrecognizable now. And when there's such a loss at that level of identity or that level of purpose and meaning, it can throw us, as you know, into what could be this cycle of where we manifest the violence because we can't tend to our suffering, because we can't name our suffering. So she spoke of two types of nostalgia. The one was this reflective nostalgia. So reflective nostalgia would be the kind of nostalgia that it's the stories that we tell when we gather with our family. In my family, we tell stories of Uncle Joe. So Uncle Joe, we also tell the story that my mother would not allow us in the room with Uncle Joe because Uncle Joe was foul-mouthed. And my mother did not want us picking up swear words. So Uncle Joe is known in our nostalgia as the foul-mouthed uncle. So we all have this nostalgia, this kind of reflecting on this. These are the stories, and to reconnect with story in this kind of nostalgia, in reflective nostalgia, to reconnect with story in origin suffices. It serves us. And it's enough. The second kind of nostalgia that she speaks of is called restorative nostalgia. And so for restorative nostalgia, it is not enough to just speak of the story. It's not enough to just tell the story of a past time. Restorative nostalgia wants to actually return and recreate the past time. Mm-hmm. So this image is an image from January 6th, which will live for us in the United States, for most of us, as a profound turning point in our democracy. What is happening now under our current administration and the movement to make America great again is, I believe, the weaponization of restorative nostalgia. To weaponize this longing and desire for the past. And when it's weaponized and also wed to power and to resources, this is what we see happening. So we can ask ourselves, who exactly was the past time great for? So I will say this too, we were seeing this, and it remains to be seen under Leo's papacy. But I believe we were seeing a movement of restorative nostalgia under Francis's papacy with the anti-Francis sentiment in the church. The movement to a restorationist past, where the ambiguity, where we're taking today's ambiguity, which for some is unmanageable, and the only way you manage ambiguity is to place boundaries and codify it. And that's what happened in the past. So we're seeing both of these tensions. We see it I think we're seeing it in our society. I don't know what you're seeing in your society, but we certainly are seeing this restorative nostalgia in spades right now. So as we kind of juxtapose that image of January 6th in my country, I also want to just bring forward these images recently of what is happening in your country and my country. And the mobilization of the people in response to what we're experiencing in terms of the way we're being represented by those in power. So I am so heartened. Every day I go on, I look at news and I wonder, do we have a regime change or not? And then I wonder which city now is going to be occupied by our military. But to be so heartened to see the demonstrations taking place throughout Washington, D.C., that was an occupied territory, and the demonstrations that are taking place in Chicago that is being threatened to be occupied by our military. And I was so heartened to see, this is an image of a peaceful march over the Sydney Harbor Bridge. It's everywhere, those pockets of the pockets of people who are rising to respond in a sense that says not in our name will this take place. And so the connection, I want to just kind of connect this back to mourning and grief and lament, where when we, in the past, where we had very clear, like in religious life, I did not live this life, but I have talked to enough sisters who have lived the life prior to Vatican II. You didn't have a lot of choices. You had to ask for what you needed. There's a lot, in my community, you were either pegged to be a teacher, a nurse, and if not, you cleaned the house or you cooked. And that was the life. Not a lot of leeway. And then the renewal happened. And then in our civil society, the kind of the uprising of the political consciousness of the people, we saw what we call the sexual revolution. We saw all of what was happening in the 1960s and the 70s, and it just collapsed the boundaries, kind of collapsed the structures that had paved lanes for us before. And now there's no lanes. There's no structure. And so what are the losses then that are happening to us? I was thinking of, so I have two brothers, and I have nieces and a nephew from the age of 18 to 30. And the world that my nieces and nephew are living in, they will never be able to achieve the quality of life that my parents had, that their grandparents had. Because the systems and structures are collapsing. All of those systems and structures are collapsing. And they're all cyclical. But it's a grief and a loss and a lament that happens so slowly that you wake up and it's totally different. And so when you think about that is the world we're living in, and that's the world we're ministering in, we're present in, we're bringing a witness to. And so what are the ways that we can be sure that we're tending our own losses so that we can create an imagined space to hold the losses with others? Because the vulnerability, the strength of our vulnerability is a strength that's not present in our society. It's not necessarily valued in our society. But vulnerability is really the essence of the spiritual life. And before we break into some conversation, I also want to acknowledge the nuance of perhaps grief and lament, where, again, we grieve the ordinary things that make us human: life and death, loss, aging, all of those things. There's a grief that's an ordinary experience of life. We didn't cause it. Nobody else did anything to us. And then I would suggest the nuance between grief and lament might be that with lament, we are complicit. What are the things within our own lives and our society, our community, that we are complicit in? The losses, the suffering that we're complicit in. And what does that call us to? So I wonder, I don't know this, I am really grappling, and I wonder this, is the difference between grief and lament. Is it the lament that there's a justice component? That we actively participate. We might not do it consciously. So I think about climate collapse and what we know about the human contribution to climate collapse. To grieve what is happening in our climate is one thing, but to lament our contribution. That's a whole other facet. And I think that is one of the areas that that is so difficult to speak about or to name. But when you think about the biblical prophets were constantly naming the complicity and constantly naming and calling for lament. So it's just, I just offer that as, kind of ongoing thinking, because there is something different. We experience the normal losses of life differently. It brings a different kind of grief than perhaps the grief that comes with knowing that, I contributed to that. And how do I make a difference? How do I change that? So I would like to pause here and offer a longer period of time, a little bit longer period of time for your conversation. Because this conversation is really the juxtaposition of grief and denial. And so this task, this prophetic work, is grieving in a society that practices denial. So we really have to understand or unpack, well, what are we denying? What does denial look like? In our own personal lives, in our communities, in the church, the world, the society. And then what is that really, what are some things that could reveal about personal or collective suffering and grief that's not being tended? As you recall Parker Palmer's observation that violence is what we see when we don't have anywhere else to go with our suffering. And what's needed to tend that, and what is ours to do? What is yours to do? So I'd like to give you about, let's go with about just 5 minutes of quiet time for yourself. Jot some notes, do some reflection. In about 5 minutes, I'll call you into conversation at your tables. And if you want to, when you go into conversation in your tables, if it's easier to hear or you prefer to pair off or go into smaller groups instead of the full table, feel free to do that. But take about 5 minutes to just really kind of reflect on what is it that is surfacing in you, and some consideration of these reflection questions.